Tucker.
So the left has refused to learn any lessons from 2016, from Brexit in the UK, or from Donald Trump's election here. Now the international left has suffered a massive defeat, their biggest in many generations. Are they ready to start listening to voters? Don't bet on it. We'll tell you how we know that next. But in the end, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party got absolutely creamed in last week's British elections. Parts of the country that had reliably voted Labour for generations suddenly went for Boris Johnson's Conservatives. It was Labour's worst defeat, the left's worst defeat since the elections of 1935, more than 80 years ago. Stinging doesn't begin to describe Britain's rejection of the left. As writer Sumantra Mitra put it, imagine the overwhelmingly Republican state of Kentucky voting for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the next presidential election. That's how shocking and unexpected the British election just was. So what exactly do the results mean for the rest of us? Well, strikingly, almost nobody on the left seems interested in finding out what it means. In a long analysis for The New Yorker, for example, British writer John Cassidy concludes that Labour lost the election because Jeremy Corbyn just wasn't a very talented politician. That's his explanation. And yet, in the very same piece, Cassidy cites a series of polls showing that Labour's economic program remained popular. But wait a second, that's confusing. If voters preferred Labour's policies on pocketbook issues, and apparently they did, why did they refuse to vote for Labour on Election Day? American liberals don't want to ponder that question or consider its implications for them and the 2020 election. Time magazine spoke for many on the left when it ran a piece entitled, "Does the UK election hold lessons for the Democrats?" Not exactly, experts say. In other words, say the experts, stop thinking so much. Everything is fine. And by the way, anyone who disagrees with that is a racist. Okay. But before we move on to the next topic, let's hear from someone who might know the answer. A lifelong Labour voter who decided to reject the Labour Party this year. His name is Paul Embury. He's a fireman from London and a longtime union activist. Embury just wrote a fascinating article explaining why Labour lost, his party, why he didn't vote for them this time. As you listen to these quotes, ask yourself if any of this sounds familiar to you as an American. Embury begins by pointing out that last week's election results may have shocked the media, but they, quote, come as no surprise to anyone who was paying attention and wasn't blinded by ideology or fanaticism. Some of us had long warned that working-class voters across post-industrial and small-town Britain were becoming increasingly alienated from the party, but we were banging our heads against a brick wall. The woke liberals who now dominate the party didn't listen to us. They believed that constantly hammering on about economic inequality would be enough to get Labour over the line. In doing so, they made a major miscalculation. They failed to grasp that working-class voters desire something more than just economic security. They want cultural security, too. They want politicians to respect their way of life and their sense of place and belonging, to elevate real-world concepts such as work, family, and community over nebulous constructs like diversity, equality, and inclusivity. By immersing itself in the destructive creed of identity politics and championing such policies such as open borders, Labour's placed itself on a completely different wavelength to millions across provincial Britain, without whose support it simply could not win power. In the end, Labour was losing a cultural war that it didn't even realize it was fighting, end quote. Embury could be writing about the United States. Replace Labour with Democratic Party, and you'd never know he was referring to a foreign country. It sounds exactly like what's happening here. Embury goes on about what must be done to fix his party. Quote, if Labour is to again be the party of the working class, it must undergo radical surgery. It must somehow rediscover the spirit of early Labour tradition that spoke to workers' patriotic and communitarian instincts and offered them a natural home. It must exploit that sweet spot in British politics that marries demands for economic justice with those for cultural stability. It must move heaven and earth to reconnect with voters in Britain's hard-pressed post-industrial and coastal towns who looked on bewildered as their communities were subjected to intense economic and cultural change, sound familiar, and felt that Labour was indifferent to their plight. It must rekindle a politics of belonging built around shared values and common cultural bonds. And crucially, it must be unremittingly post-liberal in perspective and policy development. But to achieve any of that, Labor must stop treating the traditional working class as though they were some kind of embarrassing elderly relative. It must learn to respect those who, for example, voted for Brexit, those who oppose large-scale immigration, those who want to see a tough and effective justice system, those who feel proud to be British, those who support the reassertion of the role of the family at the center of society, those who prefer a welfare system to be based around reciprocity, something for something, rather than universal entitlement, those who believe in the nation-state and do not obsess about multiculturalism or trans rights. Such people were once welcomed by the Labour Party and felt entirely comfortable voting for it. But now, so many of the party's activists look upon these voters as if they were a different species altogether. And the price has been paid in millions of lost votes. End quote. So there you have it. Patriotic, practical, tolerant, but skeptical of change for its own sake. That's how Embry describes traditional labor voters. He could be writing about the middle class in virtually any country in the world. Normal people are pretty much the same wherever you go. They believe in laws and borders and traditions and families. They think men and women are different. They consider heroin more dangerous than carbon emissions. They believe in God. At the same time, they're not libertarian on economic matters. They tend to be distrustful of finance, for example. They know the downside of debt. They're the ones making the interest payments. They're not eager to cut entitlements either. They very often rely on those entitlements. When the costs of gasoline and healthcare and education go up, they are the first to feel the pain. These aren't people who are going to lecture you about the glories of entrepreneurship or lobby for capital gains tax cuts. These are people who work for wages, not dividends. As a group, the middle class is culturally conservative and economically populist. They're the mirror image of the people in charge around the world. And a politician who bothered to learn that, who cared enough to represent their views, would be elected in a landslide in America as in Great Britain. And yet both parties in both countries consistently refuse to learn this lesson or even acknowledge it. Why is that? Theology, really. Every society has a state religion, whether it's acknowledged or not. In our country, our state religion is woke politics. And to the left, it's really all that matters. When Jeremy Corbyn began giving his preferred pronouns in campaign ads, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez promptly endorsed him. The two live on different continents, but they speak the same language of the elite progressive left. It's a frivolous and silly language, one that offers nothing to the voters who get them elected. And that's why those voters are abandoning the elite left in Britain and here. You just saw it happen with the Labour Party. And at this rate, you will see it happen in our country come November.